Hey, welcome back to Compounding Quietly. A 0.1% expense ratio feels too small to matter. That feeling is exactly what makes it dangerous. You're not wrong to focus on returns most investors do. But what if the real cost isn't in the return at all? Let's actually look at this clearly. Every time investors compare two similar funds, they look at the same three things: performance over the last few years, the brand behind the fund, and almost as an afterthought, the expense ratio. That order is backwards. Performance history tells you what already happened, under conditions that won't repeat exactly. The expense ratio tells you what will happen every single year, regardless of what the market does. It is the one number in this comparison that is actually guaranteed. Most investors treat a 0.1% or 0.3% difference as a rounding error. On a single year's statement, it practically is. You won't feel it. Your account balance won't visibly dip because of it. That's exactly why it gets ignored. There's no painful moment that forces you to notice it. No red number, no alert, no headline. It just sits there, year after year, quietly taking a small percentage of everything you've invested. That includes gains that haven't even happened yet. This is where most investors get their judgment backwards. They ask, how much could this fund earn me? The better question is, how much of what this fund earns will I actually keep? That single shift changes how you compare any two funds. It's not about chasing the lowest possible fee at any cost. It's about understanding that fees are not a one-time decision. They are a permanent tax on every future dollar of growth. That tax applies automatically, without your involvement, for as long as you hold the position. That's the criteria that matters here, not which fund had the better year. It's which fund costs you the least to simply exist in for decades. Here's the judgment criteria that should guide the rest of this conversation. A fee doesn't just cost you money once. It costs you money on money you haven't made yet. That's what makes expense ratio compounding different from almost any other cost in investing. Picture two investors, each, starting with the same $10,000 in funds, tracking the same broad market. Both funds are expected to return roughly 7% a year before fees. The only difference between them is the expense ratio. One fund charges 0.03%. The other charges 0.50%. On paper, that gap looks almost irrelevant, less than 0.5%. Easy to dismiss. But that fee isn't taken from your original contribution. It's taken from your entire balance, every year, including all the growth that balance has already accumulated. In year one, the difference between the two investors is a few dollars. Nothing either of them would notice. By year 10, the gap is no longer just about the fee itself. It's about the growth that fee has quietly canceled out along the way. By year 20, the higher cost investor isn't only 20 years of fees behind. They're behind on the compounding that those fees prevented from ever happening in the first place. Run the actual math, and that small gap often turns into tens of thousands of dollars over 2 decades on the exact same underlying investment. This is the part most return comparisons completely miss. A fund's published return already reflects its expense ratio, but it doesn't show you what that same money could have grown into at a lower cost. Now picture an investor who picks a fund because it has a slightly better story, or a more familiar name. 5 years in, the fund is performing fine, nothing alarming, nothing that would trigger a second look. That investor has no reason to ever revisit the expense ratio line again. There is no moment of pain that forces a reevaluation. The judgment was made once, early, and then quietly compounded in the wrong direction for every year after. That's the real cost of expense ratio compounding. It doesn't punish you with a bad year. It quietly removes a good one. For 2 decades, without ever announcing itself. So coming back to the core question, what does expense ratio compounding actually cost you over 20 years? It isn't a fixed number you can point to on a single statement. It's the gap between the portfolio you have and the portfolio you would have had. That gap exists because a small percentage was quietly subtracted from every year of growth, without exception. The direction this points to is simple, even if it isn't dramatic. When two funds offer comparable exposure, the expense ratio is not a minor detail to check last. It is one of the few variables in this entire decision. You can know with certainty before you commit a single dollar. Everything else returns. Market conditions, fund flows, stays uncertain. The fee does not. That's why it deserves to be a primary criterion, not an afterthought you glance at after you've already decided. The market will keep giving you new funds, new narratives, and new reasons to reconsider your choice. None of that changes what a fee actually does over 20 years. It doesn't ask whether the market was up or down this year. It applies the same way in every environment, every cycle, every headline. That consistency is exactly why it belongs at the center of your criteria, not the edge of it. You don't need to predict where markets go next to use this. You only need to know that cost compounds in the same direction as growth, except backwards. The lower the cost, the more of your own compounding you actually keep. That's not a guess about the future. It's simply a fact about how the math already works. Returns will always be uncertain. The fee you pay to chase them never is. That's the criteria that doesn't change, no matter what the market does. Compounding quietly. Slow, steady wealth building. If this helped, subscribe and leave a like. Everything here is for informational purposes only. All final decisions and responsibilities remain with you. Thanks for spending time with Compounding Quietly today.